Hello everyone and welcome back. Picture the scene. It is 1429. The city of Alton's is under siege, the fate of France hanging by a thread. A young peasant girl, claiming to be sent by God, leads a demoralized army, and right there by her side is a man of noble birth, a brilliant and fearless military commander. He is the epitome of chivalry. A protector of the innocent, a beacon of hope for a broken kingdom. He helps her lift the siege. He fights beside her in Patay, and he stands in the great cathedral of Rheims as she crowns their king. Charles V, his name is Gilles de Rais, Baron of Retz, Marshal of France, a national hero. Remember that image, burn it into your mind. The loyal soldier, the pious knight, the friend of a saint. Because the story we are about to tell is how that man, that very same hero, became a monster whispered about in nightmares. A creature whose crimes were so vile, so unspeakable, that they would echo through centuries, birthing the legend of Bluebeard himself. This isn't a story about a man who had a dark side. It is a story about a man who was a national treasure, and then, in the shadows of his magnificent castles, became the very definition of evil. The death of Joan of Arc in 1431 was a turning point, not just for France, but for the man who had fought so loyally beside her. With her gone, something in Gilles de Rais seemed to break. The fire of holy war that had consumed him was extinguished, and in its place a cold, empty void began to grow. He retired from military life, a man in his late 20s, and retreated to his vast estates in Brittany and the Loire Valley. And when I say vast, you have to understand the scale of his wealth. Gilles was one of the richest men in all of Europe. He had inherited immense fortunes from both his father and his maternal grandfather. He owned dozens of castles, sprawling forests, entire towns. His personal chapel had a choir that revelled the popes. He travelled with a retinue of 200 knights. He was, for all intents and purposes, a prince in his own right. But wealth without purpose can be a poison, and for Gilles it became a slow, acting one that rotted him from the inside out. He began to spend money with a recklessness that bordered on insanity. He commissioned a theatrical play of his own life, a spectacular production called The Mystery of the Siege of Orsanton's, starring himself. Of course, it was a colossal flop, a financial black hole that cost him a fortune. He surrounded himself with a court of flatterers, sycophants, and dubious characters, all eager to help him spend his inheritance. His castles, particularly the imposing fortress of Tiffauges, became stages for decadent parties, lavish feasts, and theatrical displays that bled his coffers dry. He sold off lands, castles, and heirlooms to fund his extravagant lifestyle, one piece at a time. His family, alarmed by his spiraling debts and erratic behavior, even had King Charles Vesey issue a decree forbidding him from selling any more of his property. But Gilles was beyond reason. He was a man chasing a shadow, trying to fill the emptiness left by war and glory with fleeting, expensive pleasures. It wasn't working. The more he spent, the emptier he felt. And that desperation, that knowingly to reclaim his lost glory and fortune, led him down a much darker path. It began, as it so often does, with a promise of impossible power. The world of the 15th century was a place where science, magic, and religion were deeply intertwined. Alchemy, the quest to turn base metals into gold, was not just a fringe pursuit. It was considered a legitimate, if secretive. For a man like Gilles, hemorrhaging money and desperate for a quick solution, it was an irresistible lure. He began to pour what remained of his fortune into the search for the philosopher's stone. He summoned so-called magicians, sorcerers, and alchemists from across Europe to his castle at Tiffauges. They were charlatans and con men, for the most part, who saw a wealthy, desperate nobleman and smelled an opportunity. They filled his head with talk of arcane rituals, of celestial alignments, and of secret formulas that could restore his wealth tenfold. Gilles, blinded by his own greed and desperation, believed them all. He built them laboratories, bought them rare and expensive ingredients, and waited for the gold that never came. But the charlatans were only the beginning. His quest for gold soon morphed into something far more sinister. When the crucibles and alembics failed to produce gold, his advisers whispered of a faster, more certain path to power. They told him of demonology, of summoning ancient and powerful entities who could grant any wish for a price. This was the true turning point. This was the moment Gilles de Rais stepped over a line from foolishness into damnation. He became obsessed with the idea of making a pact with the devil. He wanted to just create gold. He wanted to command the forces that govern creation itself. He sought a demon, a familiar, a being of immense power who would serve him. The name they whispered in his ear was Baron, and to summon Baron, they told him, required sacrifices. Not of animals or of incense, but of something pure, something innocent. And at the heart of this dark new chapter was a man from Florence named Francesco Prelati. Prelati was not like the other bump. He was young, charismatic, intelligent, and deeply versed in the occult. He presented himself as a master of the dark arts, a man who could conjure demons at will. Gilles was captivated. Prelati became his confidant, his spiritual guide into the abyss. Together, in the stone-walled chambers of Tifoges, they conducted their profane rituals. They drew circles of protection, chanted invocations from forbidden books, and offered blood to the darkness. And it was here, in this pursuit of demonic power, that the first child disappeared. No one knows the exact moment it started. It wasn't a sudden flood, but a slow, terrifying trickle. A peasant boy sent on an errand, who never returned, a young choir-boy who vanished on his way home from the chapel, a girl who was last seen playing near the castle walls. At first, these were just isolated tragedies, the kind of sorrowful mysteries that plagued rural life in the Middle Ages. Children were vulnerable. They could get lost in the woods, fall into rivers, be taken by wolves. But soon the disappearances became a pattern. They were too frequent, too concentrated in the lands surrounding the estates of the Baron of Retz. A quiet, creeping terror began to take hold of the countryside. Parents started barring their doors at night, forbidding their children from straying too far from home. Whispers started to circulate. They were hushed, terrified whispers, because the man they suspected was not some common brigand. He was the Marshal of France, a lord of immense power. Who could possibly accuse such a man? Who would dare? The whispers spoke of strange lights in the windows of Tifoges at night, of screams carried on the wind. They spoke of the Baron's strange retainers, men like Gilles de Siltot and Roger de Briqueville, and his two closest, most brutal servants, a man known as Poitou and another named Henriette. These were the men who were seen lingering near villages, their eyes always seeming to scan the groups of playing children. They were the ones who would offer a child a sweet treat, a coin, or a promise of work at the castle, and the children they spoke to were never seen again. The scale of the horror was unimaginable, precisely because it was hidden in plain sight. Gilles de Rais used his power and prestige as a shield. He was the local lord, the dispenser of justice. He was untouchable. The parents of the missing children were poor peasants. Their word meant nothing against a man who had stood with a saint and crowned a king. To complain was to risk eviction, a beating, or worse, and so they suffered in silence. The number of missing grew, 10, 20, 50. The true number will never be known, but estimates based on later testimony range from 80 to 200, perhaps even more. For years, Gilles de Rais and his inner circle operated with complete impunity. Inside the cold, stone walls of his castles, a private kingdom of torture and murder flourished. Prelati would perform his rituals, calling upon his demon baron, while Gilles and his men supplied the sacrifices. They scoured the countryside for their victims, preferring young boys with fair hair and blue eyes, whom they believed were most pleasing to the demonic entities. The children would be brought to the castle, often under the guise of being hired as pages or servants. They would be dressed in fine clothes, given good food, and for a brief, terrifying moment, treated like nobility. It was a perverse game, a prelude to the horror that was to come. Gilles, it seemed, was not just killing for ritualistic purposes. He was killing for pleasure. The alchemy, the demonology, it had all become an excuse, a justification for a bottomless well of sadistic cruelty that had been lurking within him all along. He had found in the crucible of war a socially acceptable. Now, in the suffocating peace of his retirement, those urges had festered and mutated into something monstrous. But even the most powerful men can grow careless. Hubris is the great undoing of tyrants, and Gilles de Rais was no exception. For nearly a decade he had gotten away with murder on an industrial scale. He had become convinced of his own invincibility, and in the spring of 1440 he made a fatal error, a mistake born not of his secret crimes, but of his public arrogance. The conflict was mundane, a petty property dispute. Gilles had sold a castle, St. Conti-en-de-Mort, to a man named Geoffroy de la Ferronne, regretting the sale, as he often did, Gilles Ferronite. But instead of negotiating, he did what he had always done, he took it by force. On Pentecost Sunday he led a small band of his men to the castle, knowing that its new treasurer, a clergyman named Gilles Le Ferron, the brother of the owner, would be celebrating Mass in the castle chapel. In a shocking act of sacrilege, Gilles and his men burst into the church during the service, dragged Jean Le Ferron from the altar, and took him prisoner. This was his undoing. It was one thing to murder the children of powerless peasants in secret. It was another thing entirely to kidnap a man of the cloth in a church during Mass. This was not just a crime against a man, it was a crime against God and his holy church, and the church did not take such insults lightly. News of the outrage spread like wildfire. The man who now had the case on his desk was Jean de Malestroit, the Bishop of Nantes. Malestroit was a powerful and shrewd political operator, and he had been hearing the terrified whispers about Gilles de Rais for years. He knew about the missing children, the dark rumors of sorcery, and the fear that choked the countryside. But he had lacked a pretext, a legal justification to move against a man as powerful as the Marshal of France. Now, Gilles had handed it to him on the kidnapping of Jean Le Ferron gave Malestroit the canonical justification he needed to launch a full-scale ecclesiastical investigation, and he knew exactly where to start. He didn't begin with the charge of sacrilege. He used it as a key to unlock a much darker door. He began quietly at first to officially investigate the rumors of heresy and witchcraft. He sent out investigators, not just to look into the church incident, but to finally give a voice to the voiceless. His agents traveled through the villages and towns in the domains of Gilles de Rais, seeking out the parents of the lost children. For the first time, these grieving, terrified people were approached by someone in authority who was willing to listen, someone who believed them. Slowly, painstakingly, a mountain of evidence began to accumulate. The investigators compiled a list of 140 missing children, a staggering number. They took dozens of depositions from parents who tearfully recounted the last time they saw their sons or daughters. A pattern emerged, so many of them had last been seen in the company of the Baron's men, particularly Henriette and Poitou. The stories were chillingly similar, a promise of a good job, a gift of money, a ride on a fine horse. And then nothing. Emboldened by the bishop's investigation, people who had been silent for years began to speak. Former servants from Gilles's household came forward with stories of strange rituals, of forbidden books, and of the Baron's obsession with alchemy. They spoke of screams in the night, of the heavy scent of burning flesh, and of small bones found in the castle fireplaces and latrines. Bishop Malestroit now had more than enough to act. In September of 1440 he joined forces with the secular authority, Pierre de Lault, Partbital, the president of the Parliament of Brittany. Together they issued a warrant. On the 15th of September 1440, Gilles de Rais, Marshal of France, hero of Ortons, was arrested, along with his key accomplices, including Henriette, Poitou, and the alchemist Francesco Prelati. The arrest sent shockwaves through the French nobility. It was unthinkable, a man of Gilles's stature, a war hero, accused of such sordid crimes. It seemed impossible, a political witch hunt designed to strip him of his remaining lands. Gilles himself certainly saw it that way. When he was brought before the ecclesiastical court in Nantes, he was the picture of aristocratic outrage and contempt. He strode into the courtroom, not as a prisoner, but as a nobleman inconvenienced by his inferiors. He mocked the judges, called Bishop Malestroit a simoniac and a scoundrel, and declared that he would rather be hanged by the neck than answer to such a corrupt court. He boasted of his military service, his friendship with the king, his unassailable rank. His arrogance was breathtaking. He refused to enter a plea, believing that his status as a peer of the realm placed him above their jurisdiction. But his defiance only hardened the resolve of his accusers. Bishop Malestroit, seeing that Gilles would not break, had him excommunicated on the spot. This was a devastating blow. In the 15th century, excommunication meant being cast out not just from the church, but from society itself. It stripped him of his rights and protections. It made him an outcast, a pariah. And it was the first crack in his armor of pride. 2 trials proceeded simultaneously. The ecclesiastical court focused on the charges of heresy, apostasy, and demon summoning. The secular court, presided over by Pierre de l'Hostopital, dealt with the more worldly and far more gruesome crimes, abduction, torture, and murder. For days Gilles maintained his defiant silence. He sat in stony contempt as a parade of witnesses. The grieving parents of his victims took the stand. They told their heartbreaking stories, one after another, their voices choked with sorrow and anger. They pointed at Gilles, the man in whose castles their children had vanished forever. Still, Gilles refused to speak. He was a stone wall of aristocratic pride. But his accomplices were not made of the same stuff. Henriette and Poitou, his loyal henchmen, were brought before the sec. They did not have the protection of rank or reputation. Faced with the overwhelming evidence and the very real threat of judicial torture, they crumbled. And they confessed everything. The testimony of Henriette and Poitou unleashed a torrent of horror upon the courtroom. The judges, the clerks, the guards, everyone present listened in stunned, nauseated silence as the 2 men described, in methodical and excruciating detail, the machinery of death they had operated for years at their master's command. They described how they would lure the children, how they would bring them to secret chambers within the castles of Tifoges and Machico. They recounted the perverse rituals that would precede the killings, how the children would be pampered and then terrorized. And then they described the murders themselves. They spoke of dozens, scores, perhaps hundreds of children. They described the methods, the instruments, the sickening pleasure their master took in the act. They explained how Gilles would often sit and watch, sometimes weeping at the beauty of his victims in their death throes, only to fly into a rage moments later. They confessed to dismembering the bodies, to burning the remains in the fireplaces, to throwing what was left into the moats and latrines. It was a confession of evil so pure and so profound that it left the courtroom breathless. When the transcripts of their confessions were read aloud to Gilles, he finally began to understand the depth of his predicament. His wall of silence was beginning to crumble, but the final blow was yet to come. The judges, having heard the confessions of his men, now had all the justification they needed to use the ultimate tool of medieval justice against Gilles himself. The threat of torture. They didn't have to use the instruments. The chief judge, Pierre de l'Hostopital, simply led Gilles into the castle's torture chamber. He showed him the rack, the strappado, the iron boot. He described exactly what would be done to his body if he continued to refuse to confess, and that finally was what broke him. Faced with the prospect of his own physical agony, the proud Marshal of France, the man who had faced down English armies, collapsed. He fell to his knees, weeping, and promised to confess everything. He was brought back to the courtroom, a changed man. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a torrent of tearful repentance. He addressed the court, not with insults, but with pleas for forgiveness. He acknowledged the authority of the judges and begged Bishop Malestroit to lift his excommunication. Then he began to speak, and his confession was even more horrifying than that of his servants, because it came from the mind that had orchestrated it all. Gilles de Rais confessed to everything. He spoke for hours, his voice thick with emotion as he recounted his descent into depravity. He admitted to the murders of more than 100 children, though he said the true number was so great he could not remember it. He spoke of his motives, a tangled web of aesthetic obsession, sadistic pleasure, and a desperate desire for knowledge and power through forbidden means. He claimed he was inspired by the lives of the Roman emperors he had read about, Tiberius, Caligula, Nero, and their decadent cruelties. He described the acts in such detail that many in the court were forced to leave, unable to listen any longer. He confessed to heresy, to summoning demons with the help of prelacy, to making pacts with evil spirits in exchange for wealth and power. He implicated everyone in his inner circle, leaving no doubt as to the scope of the conspiracy. It was a full, complete, and utterly damning confession. At the end of it, he turned to the gallery, to the parents of the children he had murdered, and he begged them for their forgiveness and for their prayers. It was a moment of supreme, almost surreal drama. The monster was on his knees, weeping like a child, on the 25th of October, 1440. The verdict was delivered. It was a foregone conclusion. Gilles de Rais was found guilty by both the ecclesiastical and secular courts. He was convicted of heresy, apostasy, sodomy, and the murder of an unknown number of children. The sentence was death. His accomplices, Henriette and Poitou, received the same sentence. As a sign of respect for his noble birth and his apparent repentance, the court granted Gilles one final request, that he be hanged before his body was consumed by the flames, a slightly more merciful end than being burned alive. On the morning of the 26th of October, 1440, Gilles de Rais and his 2 henchmen were taken to a public meadow outside the city of Nantes. A huge crowd had gathered to witness the end of the monster who had terrorized them for so long. Gilles seemed to play his final role with a sort of pious dignity. He made a speech, warning the crowd against the sins of pride and indulgence that had led to his downfall. He led the procession to the gallows, reportedly comforting his 2 servants, telling them to die bravely and to place their trust in God. He was hanged first. His body was cut down from the gallows before the fire could fully consume it, and a group of high-born ladies from Nantes claimed it for a Christian burial, a final testament to his enduring status. Even in death, they were hanged, and their bodies were burned to ashes. The story did not end there. Francesco Prelati, the charismatic sorcerer who had led Gilles down the path of demonology, managed to escape the same fate for a time. His knowledge of the occult made him a valuable asset, and he was employed by others who sought his dark wisdom. His luck eventually ran out, however, and he was later arrested for other crimes and executed. The vast estates of Gilles de Rais, which may have been the true prize all along for some, were carved up and distributed among his powerful rivals, including the Duke of Brittany. The castles that had been the scenes of such unspeakable horror fell into ruin or passed to new owners, their stones holding the memory of what had transpired within. The legacy of Gilles de Rais became a cautionary tale, a legend whispered by firesides. Over the centuries, the historical facts blurred with folklore. His story, the story of a rich, powerful nobleman who murdered his victims within a locked castle, is widely believed to be the primary inspiration for the famous fairy tale of Bluebeard, the monstrous aristocrat who kills his wives and keeps their bodies in a hidden room. The hero of France had become a fairy tale villain, a boogeyman to frighten children. But even today, questions linger. Was Gilles de Rais truly the monster his confession painted him to be, or was there something else at play? Some historians have argued that his trial was a sham, a carefully orchestrated plot by his political enemies, primarily the Duke of Brittany, to seize his vast wealth. They point to the fact that his confession was extracted under the threat of torture, a common practice at the time that often yielded false admissions of guilt. They argue that the charges of heresy and witchcraft were a convenient way for the church and state to confiscate his property. They suggest that while Gilles may have been a decadent and violent man, the scale of his crimes was wildly exaggerated for political and financial gain. It's a compelling argument. The legal proceedings were certainly suspect by modern standards, and the primary beneficiaries of his fall were indeed his powerful neighbors. However, the sheer weight of the evidence presented at the trial is difficult to dismiss. The testimony of his own men, the dozens of eyewitness accounts from the parents, and the discovery of physical evidence, including bone fragments, at his castles, all point to a grim reality. Furthermore, Gilles' own confession, while obtained under duress, was remarkably detailed and specific, containing information that only the perpetrator could have known. Perhaps it is possible that a conspiracy to bring him down did exist, but it was a conspiracy that happened to target a man who was genuinely, monstrously guilty. His enemies may have wanted his land, but in pursuing it, they uncovered a horror far greater than they could have imagined. In the end, we are left with the chilling duality of the man himself. The hero and the monster inextricably linked, the chivalrous knight who fought alongside a saint and the sadistic killer who preyed on the innocent. Gilles de Rais forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth, that the capacity for great good and for unimaginable evil can exist within the same human heart. His life is a testament to how quickly a man can fall, how glory can curdle into depravity, and how the hero of one chapter of history can become the villain of the next. The story isn't just about a medieval monster. It is a timeless warning about the darkness that can lurk behind a mask of power, piety, and prestige. That is all for today. If you enjoyed this journey into the unknown, be sure to like and subscribe for more. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.